You cannot step into the same shower twice. Either the shower changes or you do, says Heraclitus to describe the inevitability of change. The theory of evolution explains that change systematically. So, one of the most fascinating aspects of science is evolution. Because as we understand evolution, we gain a better understanding of the true reasons and motivations behind many of our behaviors. In other words, the path to understanding human mentality goes through understanding evolution. And if you want to complete your evolution, you can subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, let's move on to our video. Evolution is the change in the distribution of genes and traits within a population over generations due to the pressure of selection. What does this mean? In simpler terms, it is the alteration of certain traits over generations and the selection of advantageous traits in living beings, which are then passed on to future generations. Evolution suggests that all living organisms currently inhabiting the Earth are related and originated from a common ancestor. So, the bird you see when you walk down the street and the plague that caused our ancestors' deaths are your relatives. Therefore, when you are tempted to say harsh things about them, please remember that they are your relatives. Evolution is not the transformation of one species into another. It's called speciation, and it's a consequence of evolution. In other words, every speciation is an evolution, but not every evolution is speciation. Sometimes, actually always, our genes undergo small changes, but we don't notice them physically. These types of changes are called microevolutions. Microevolutions accumulate, leading to observable changes in the body. This is referred to as macroevolution. Evolution is not a living being going to sleep as a monkey and waking up as a human. Changes in evolution occur gradually. For a change to happen, it must be beneficial in the intermediate stages of development. Let's take the eye for an example. Although the eye may seem complex and perfect now, it was not always so. The most ancestral form of the eye is actually light-sensitive cells. In some organisms, certain cells specialize to detect the presence of light. This adaptation provided an advantage against other competing organisms. Yes and no. To answer this, we first need to define the term theory. In everyday life, we often use the word theory for our hunches or not entirely certain predictions. However, in the scientific context, the situation is quite different. In science, we call explanations that help us understand how a phenomenon works. So, the theory of evolution, like many other theories, is always a theory and will remain so. Laws, on the other hand, actually refer to a rule and principle. There is plenty of evidence for the occurrence of evolution. We can start with whales, for example. The evolution of whales is one of the evolutionary processes we know most clearly. All living marine mammals come from terrestrial mammals. This is a whale, and this is its skeleton. One of the most apparent pieces of evidence is the presence of rear leg bones in whales, which are completely detached from the spine and entirely vestigial. In addition to this, we can consider many vestigial organs in the human body as evidence. For example, the wisdom teeth in humans no longer develop in 35% of the population. Even when they do, they often emerge either decayed or extremely painful. One common reason for the vestigialization of wisdom teeth is the limited space in the jawbone. As our brains have evolved, our jaws have shrunk, and consequently, there is not enough room for our teeth. The same holds true for the appendix. The appendix is normally a haven for bacteria that digest cellulose, which is used to digest plants. However, as humans transition to a more meat-heavy diet, the appendix gradually shrank. A separate video will cover vestigial organs in humans and other organisms. In that video, we will delve into this topic in more detail. We can essentially categorize the mechanisms of evolution into two groups: diversity mechanisms and selection mechanisms. Diversity mechanisms lead to differences in future generations compared to the current ones. The most important mechanism among these is mutations. Mutations represent a permanent change in the DNA sequence of a gene. Mutations can occur naturally or be triggered by external factors such as radiation and certain chemicals. Although this process largely occurs randomly, it does not mean that evolution operates randomly. Selection mechanisms ensure that those changes occurring randomly are selected based on the best adaptation to the environment. Now, let's look at the three most important selection mechanisms: natural selection, sexual selection, and artificial selection. Natural selection is the name given to the mechanism determined by the success of survival. In other words, mutations we randomly possess can provide advantages for some organisms, while disadvantages for others. Later on, those organisms with advantages survive, while those with disadvantages are eliminated through death. This process selects beneficial mutations from the random diversity. For example, during the Industrial Revolution in England, the bark color of trees darkened due to the impact of industrial pollution in the atmosphere. Darker moths became less noticeable in the polluted environment, gaining a better chance of protection against predators. Sexual selection is not about survival, but rather about reproduction. You could have a very long lifespan. In this long life, you might have excelled in areas such as education, sports, and art. However, if you don't reproduce, evolutionarily speaking, you are unsuccessful. The sole criterion for evolutionary success is how many children you have. In other words, you must make yourself appealing to the opposite sex. So, how can you do that? Let's look at one of the extreme examples of this: peacocks. As you know, male peacocks have colorful and elaborate tails. This tail is so large that it makes the peacock clumsy and reduces its chances of survival. So, why hasn't natural selection eliminated this? Because this large tail sends a message to the female. Despite this large and cumbersome tail, I can still survive. The same applies to humans. Symmetrical faces appear more attractive to us because they convey the image of I am healthy. Finally, let's look at artificial selection, probably one of humanity's greatest discoveries. Artificial selection is the name given to the version of all these selection processes directly performed by humans. Many organisms around us have undergone this process: racehorses, sheep, cows, numerous fruits, and vegetables. But the species that best illustrate artificial selection for us are wolves, or should I say, dogs. Before the agricultural revolution, our ancestors lived in close proximity to the dangers of nature. Faced with these dangers, our ancestors sought allies. Wolves were large, aggressive, and dangerous, but not all of them. Therefore, our ancestors began to change them by breeding wolves with the traits they needed. To not miss upcoming content on similar topics and other new videos, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video.